April 18, 1944. 25,000 feet above the Alps. The air is thin, the sunlight harsh, and the cold so sharp it bites through metal. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses drone steadily eastward, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Below them, clouds stretch across the sky like torn white blankets. Above them, nothing but the endless blue of a war-torn heaven. Inside the lead bomber, sweat drips down the back of Staff Sergeant William Carter's neck despite the freezing cold. His gloved fingers tap anxiously on the .50 caliber machine gun beside him. He's flown enough missions to know when the sky feels wrong. And today, feels wrong. The intercom crackles. Bandits at 6 o'clock. Closing fast. The gunner swings the turret, praying he's quick enough. Black specks appear on the horizon, Focke-Wulf 190s, slicing through the sky like steel predators hungry for slow, lumbering bombers. Panic flickers across the crew. Then someone shouts from the radio room. A voice full of disbelief and relief all at once. Red tails. We got red tails at our 9. Out of the blinding sunlight, four P-51 Mustangs tear into view, their engines screaming as they roll into a protective arc around the bombers. The planes shimmer silver in the high-altitude light, but it's the tail that grabs every eye. A streak of vivid, impossible bright red, glowing like a warning flare against the blue sky. The German fighters hesitate. They know exactly who those pilots are. And so do the bomber crews. Captain Charles "Buddy" Johnson, one of the Tuskegee Airmen, angles his Mustang downward. His voice is calm, steady, precise, the voice of a man who has fought too hard to ever doubt his place in the sky. Red leader to bomber group, we have your backs. The moment those words hit the radio, every man inside the flying fortresses exhales at the same time. Because if any fighter group could keep them alive through this gauntlet of German fire, it was the 332nd Fighter Group, the men whose tails burned crimson. The Red Tails. A name whispered with gratitude by bomber crews. A name cursed with frustration by the Luftwaffe. A name that had already begun to reshape the story of air power in World War II. But the paint, the iconic, defiant red, wasn't just a symbol. It started as something small. Practical. Almost accidental. And it would become a legend. But before the world learned to trust that streak of color in the sky, before commanders started requesting them by name, and before a single tail was ever painted red, there was a different story. A harder one. A story of training fields in the dust-choked heat of Alabama. Of prejudice, doubt, and relentless discipline. Of a group of men who were told in 1,000 ways that they did not belong in the cockpit of an American fighter plane. And a story of how they proved everyone wrong, one sortie, one escort mission, one life saved at a time. The sky above the Alps explodes in tracer fire as the German fighters break toward the bombers. Buddy Johnson rolls his Mustang, lining up the first shot. The bright red tail flashes like a strike of lightning as he dives. This is the moment the world will remember. But the path to this sky, the path to that red tail, began long before today. Long before the war. Long before the world believed in them. It began with the dream of becoming pilots, in an America that said they never could. Tuskegee Army Airfield, Alabama. Summer, 1941. The sun beats down on the red clay runways, turning the horizon into a shimmering haze. Heat radiates from the corrugated metal roofs of the hangars, and the smell of oil, dust, and hot engine parts hangs thick in the air. This is where the journey began. Not in the sky. Not in the cockpit. But here, on the ground, under the weight of doubt heavy enough to crush any dreamer. Cadet Benjamin O. Davis Jr., straight-backed and stone-faced, marches across the flight line. His boots strike the ground with perfect rhythm. Discipline radiates from him like heat from the tarmac. Son of one of the Army's highest-ranking black officers, Davis grew up understanding two things, duty and scrutiny. And at Tuskegee, scrutiny followed every man. White officers watched the cadets with a gaze colder than steel, whispering predictions that these young black men would fail, that they lacked the nerve, the intellect, the temperament to fly combat aircraft. But every cadet knew what was really happening here. They were not being trained. They were being tested. Tested to justify their existence in the sky. Cadet Luther H. Smith tightens the straps on his parachute as the instructor pilot steps toward him. The man's face is unreadable, but his voice is sharp. "If you want to fly, Smith, don't make a fool of yourself." Smith doesn't respond. He simply gives a crisp nod, climbs into the cockpit of the yellow-painted Et-6 Texan trainer, and starts the engine. The propeller roars to life, swirling dust into a blinding cyclone. Every flight was a battle. Not against the enemy, but against expectation. In the barracks at night, the men cleaned their boots, polished their insignia, and recited checklists until they could perform them blindfolded. Not because regulations demanded it, but because a single slip could be used to condemn every pilot who would come after them. The instructors made sure of that. Emergency procedure drills ran until dawn. Formation flying repeated until muscle memory replaced fatigue. Engine-out simulations ended with bruises more often than clean landings. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't get the luxury of mistakes. And yet, something extraordinary began to happen. Despite the pressure, despite the prejudice, despite the watchful eyes waiting for them to fail, the men excelled. Their maneuvers were crisp. Their discipline unmatched. Their endurance unbreakable. Even the instructors began to whisper, at first quietly, then with a hint of respect. "These men can fly." But earning wings was only the beginning. Because the sky they were heading toward wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. And as the first graduating pilots were assigned to the 99th Fighter Squadron, preparing for deployment to North Africa, one issue loomed over every briefing, every meeting, every flight test. How do you identify who's who when the sky turns into chaos? Fighter groups needed quick visual markers, colors, symbols, stripes, something that stood out during high-speed combat maneuvers. Other units had already adopted painted nose cones, wing bands, or tail flashes. For the Tuskegee squadrons, the decision came down from command quickly. Paint the tails red. Make them unmistakable. A practical order. Simple. Functional. No one at Tuskegee realized at that moment what the color would become. How that bright streak would evolve from an identification mark into a badge of honor. But the men felt something the moment the first tail was painted. Pilot Clarence "Lucky" Lester walked a slow circle around his newly marked plane, studying the crimson color glowing in the sun. He ran a hand across the stabilizer, and a small smile touched his lips. It wasn't just a paint job. It was a promise. A promise to each other. A promise to their families back home. A promise to every pilot they would protect in the skies over Europe. If you see red behind you, you're going to make it home. And soon they would be called into their first combat missions, missions that would test everything they had fought to earn. Missions where bomber crews had no idea who the Tuskegee Airmen were. Not yet. But they were about to find out. North Africa. June 2, 1943. Over the Mediterranean Sea. The first combat sortie of the 99th Fighter Squadron slices through the heat-hazed sky. Beneath them, the Mediterranean glitters like shattered glass. Above them, the air vibrates with engine roar and the metallic scent of anticipation. Lieutenant Charles Dryden checks his instruments again, altitude steady, oil pressure perfect, formation tight. He's flown these P-40 Warhawks 100 times in training. But today the ground below is enemy territory. Today, every shadow might hide a German fighter. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen step into the war. Their task is simple on paper. Dive-bomb enemy positions at Pantelleria, a fortified island bristling with anti-aircraft guns. But the men know the truth. Nothing in war is simple. Dryden glances left, where Lieutenant William Campbell flies wingtip to wingtip. Campbell gives a small nod, the kind pilots use when radios fall silent but resolve stays strong. The formation descends, diving through the Mediterranean sun. Then the first shell bursts. A black flower of smoke blooms beside the lead plane. Anti-aircraft batteries open fire, stitching the sky with explosions. The P-40s weave, dodge, dive. Metal rattles. Instruments shake. The scent of cordite fills the cockpit. But the Tuskegee pilots hold their line. Discipline is their backbone. Precision is their weapon. Dryden locks onto his target, a cluster of enemy defenses camouflaged among rocks, and releases his bombs. The explosion lights the coastline, shaking the air. Campbell's bomb strikes seconds later, followed by the rest of the squadron. The mission succeeds. The first of many. But the radio chatter that night tells a more complicated story. Because victory in the sky didn't mean victory on the ground. Not yet. Despite their performance, despite their accuracy, despite their discipline, the 99th still faced skepticism from some commanders and prejudice from others. General William Momyer filed a scathing report claiming the Tuskegee pilots lacked aggressiveness, a claim later proven false by hard data and eyewitness accounts. But at the time, the words threatened the squadron's future. The men knew what was at stake. Every sortie became more than a mission. Every engagement became a defense of their right to fly. So they pushed harder. Over Sicily, Lieutenant Wendell Pruitt turned his P-40 into a scalpel, carving through enemy fortifications with pinpoint accuracy. Over Italy, Lieutenant Span Watson led daring strafing runs that obliterated German convoys. And on a blistering day over Anzio, Lieutenant Charles B. Hall became the first Tuskegee pilot to shoot down an enemy aircraft in combat, a Focke-Wulf 190 that burst into flames under his steady fire. With every mission, their reputation grew. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that would turn a red-painted tail into a symbol the whole world recognized, came after the squadron transitioned to the sleek, deadly P-51 Mustang. A plane built for speed. Built for power. Built for escort duty. Ramitz Airfield, Italy. July 1944. The 332nd Fighter Group gathers on the runway as the first Mustangs roll into view. Silver bodies gleam like polished mirrors in the sun. The propellers spin with a deep, confident growl. And the tails? They burn bright red. Not a muted color. Not a dark, military maroon. But a bold, defiant crimson visible from miles away. When African-American ground crews finish painting, they step back, proud, silent, and the pilots stand in awe. The Mustangs look like nothing else in the sky. But the beauty isn't what matters. What matters is what comes next. Because the 332nd is assigned to the one mission bomber crews fear most. Long-range escort duty. Deep into German territory. Where fighters swarm like hornets. Bomber group commanders had heard rumors, stories of the colored pilots who stayed glued to formation instead of chasing enemy fighters for glory. Stories of a discipline unmatched by other units. But stories were only stories. Until the first escort mission. August 1944. 30,000 feet above Ploiești. Dozens of B-24 Liberators rumble through the sky, headed straight for one of the most heavily defended oil complexes in Europe. The mission is suicide-level dangerous. German fighters gather ahead like a wall of teeth. The bomber's radio operator panics. Where the hell are our escorts? We're dead without them. Then a voice cuts through the static. Calm. Smooth. Unmistakable. Red leader to bomber group, we're in position. A formation of Mustangs drops in from above, wings aligned perfectly, tails glowing a brilliant crimson in the harsh sunlight. The bomber crews erupt with relief. Red tails. We got the red tails. The Germans dive. The Mustangs dive faster. And in that moment, in that swirling chaos of tracer fire and screaming engines, the legend becomes reality. Because while other fighter groups break formation to chase kills, the red tails never leave their bombers. Not once. The bombers complete their run. The Mustangs peel away only when the threat is over. And when they return to base, the mission debrief says it all. 0 bombers lost. A near impossible achievement. That day, the bomber crews make a simple request to command. If we fly again, we want the red tails with us. And from that moment forward, the color red no longer marks a squadron. It marks a promise. Winter, 1945. Somewhere over southern Germany. The war is reaching its breaking point. Cities burn below. The sky is thick with smoke, flak bursts, and the desperate final resistance of a collapsing Luftwaffe. A formation of B-17s pushes deeper into enemy territory than ever before. Fuel is tight. Morale is tighter. Every man aboard knows the stakes. They also know who flies just behind them. Because at this stage of the war, the bomber crews no longer ask, "Who's escorting us?" They ask only, "Are the red tails with us today?" Captain Roscoe Brown leads his section of P-51 Mustangs through the clouds. His gloved hand rests lightly on the throttle, his eyes scan the sky ahead. The bright red tail of his aircraft gleams against the gray storm of war, bold, defiant, unmissable. Suddenly, out of the clouds, a pack of Me-262 jet fighters rips into view, Germany's fastest, deadliest aircraft. Their engines howl like tearing metal. They streak toward the bombers with terrifying speed. The jet age has arrived, and Brown knows exactly what that means. A single successful pass could wipe out an entire bomber formation. His voice remains steady as he calls out, "Red section, break and engage." The Mustangs dive. The jets slash past, cannon fire ripping the air. But they overshoot, their speed a blessing and a curse. When they loop back for a second attack, Brown is ready. He pulls the trigger. A stream of .50 caliber tracers arcs forward, connecting with the engine of the lead Me-262. The jet erupts in smoke, spiraling downward as Brown rolls away from the explosion. The bombers hold steady. The escorts regroup. The German attack is broken. Later, in the debriefing tent, the bomber crews crowd around the Tuskegee pilots, not with suspicion, not with hesitation, but with gratitude bordering on reverence. A grizzled B-17 pilot, still shaking from adrenaline, grips Brown's hand with both of his. "When we see those red tails," he says, voice cracking, "we know we're coming home." These words echo across bases, across officers' mess halls, across the entire Mediterranean theater. Escorted bomber loss rates drop. Mission success rates skyrocket. And soon, official paperwork begins listing the same phrase again and again. Request red tails if available. Not as a courtesy. Not as a gesture. As a requirement for survival. The war ends, but the red tails keep flying. When Germany finally collapses and the guns fall silent, the red tails return home to an America still struggling to accept them. Medals are awarded, but segregation remains. Praise is spoken, but equality is denied. Yet the legacy they carved in the sky cannot be erased. Over 15,000 sorties. Over 1,000 missions. Hundreds of bomber crews saved. And through it all, their trademark. Bright red tails. A color chosen for visibility. A color transformed into a symbol. A symbol reborn decades later in films, documentaries, and the proud memories of veterans who lived to tell the tale. When history speaks of the Tuskegee Airmen, it speaks of excellence earned through grit, courage, and impossible discipline. It speaks of men who proved themselves not with arguments, But with actions. Not with demands. But with performance. Not with anger. But with mastery of the one place no one ever expected them to command. The sky. Why they painted them red. Those crimson tails began as a simple identification mark. A way for friendly pilots and commanders to track their squadron in the chaos of combat. But they became something greater. A promise. A reputation. A legend carried on silver wings. When bomber crews looked back and saw that streak of color behind them, they didn't just see escort fighters. They saw guardians. They saw skill few could match. They saw discipline no one could deny. They saw men who overcame every obstacle placed before them and still flew higher. And in that color, in that bright red splash across the tail, they saw hope. Hope that they would survive. Hope that someone had their back. Hope that, today, they would live to see another sunrise. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just paint their tails red. They painted their legacy across the sky. Their legend still flies. Their courage still echoes. And their red tails still burn bright in the story of World War II. A color no enemy ever forgot. And no ally ever stopped requesting.